If I touch the mic, it's gonna move funny and then we won't be able to speak into it, it'll be a disaster. So can everyone hear me? Yes. Excellent. So just kind of the boring stuff first. If you have anything that makes noise, if you have a phone, a watch, a tablet, a beeper, I don't know, something else that makes noise, if you can make sure it won't throughout the evening, really appreciate it. There's a trash can at the counter and there's a couple back in the garden for any cups or napkins that you might have. And at the end of Scott's talk, he's going to sign the books, but he's going to sign them in the middle of the store. Very conveniently, the counter where you can buy the books is in the middle.
Buy the book.
Buy the book. You're going to buy the whole book out. It's going to be great.
Different from doing things by the book.
Yes.
Buy the book.
Buy the book.
That's a new meaning.
So I'm Rosie, I'm the events coordinator here at Readers Books. And you know, the thing about Readers, I don't know how many of you know Andy, the owner, but we're not very sporty over here at Readers Books. Right, so we won't tell him about this, right? And I was thinking about it and I was like, you know, I know maybe two things about lacrosse, maybe three. I know that you play it with a very interesting looking stick. I know that it was first invented by Native Americans, and I know that everybody that I know who has played it ever really likes pink polo shirts. And they're very sporty in a very specific way. I went to college in New England, so these are all the people I knew. So when we got the book in, I looked at it and went, this is a very long book with much more than 3 things. So obviously Scott will know a lot more about lacrosse and his book than I will. If you guys can give him a really big round of applause.
So I just want you to know, as a writer on a book, this tour is a little bit exaggerated, but you never know if anyone's going to show up. So when I say this, I really mean it. Thank you for coming. This doesn't make any sense that I'm here doing a reading, on paper anyway. In Northern California, lacrosse is notoriously a northeastern sport. And although the head coach at Sonoma High School is here today, and I'm honored to have him. You know, it's a relatively new sport to California, and there are other sports that are playing it. But it actually really does make sense that I'm here, because Northern California is where I cut my teeth on becoming a journalist. It's where I became what I am, and it's really responsible for, in many ways, what this book is. In 1984, got a job at the Sacramento Bee and worked there for 6 years. And at the age of 23, was named the first beat writer for the Sacramento Kings when they moved from Kansas City. It was a terrifying experience because I had really no reporting skills whatsoever. But one of the things that it taught me, and it really stuck with me, is that you know, a sports team like the Sacramento Kings, you know, an NBA team, wasn't just a sports team. It was an emblem. It was a designation. It was a barometer that measured where this city was. Sacramento wanted desperately to be considered a big league town, and like on par with Oakland and San Francisco and Portland and Seattle and LA. And somehow in our society, it had become clear that one of the ways to do that and to mark that was to get a professional sports team. And so I'm covering what I think is just a basketball team, but is really a civic trumpet. It is an instrument of pride, and people are pouring themselves into it in a way that has almost nothing to do with basketball, because frankly, Sacramento wasn't even a basketball town. In 1987, my future wife and I, Fran Brennan, moved down to San Francisco, and it was arguably the first real golden age of of Bay Area sports. I mean, the team, the A's and the Giants were incredible and going into the World Series, and the 49ers were experiencing their great first heyday under Joe Montana as a dynasty. And I happened to be along for that ride. And in 1989, I was doing a lot of stories, not just about baseball. I was covering the Bay Area sports scene, but also sort of looking at what the Giants and the A's meant to the city and the communities, and realized that there's this sort of old line San Francisco establishment that really informed the Giants' sort of place in the city, and at the same time in the East Bay, the A's with Dave Stewart and Ricky Henderson and Mike Norris were really a vehicle for pride of Black Oakland. And this stuff was well beyond, sort of balls and strikes and wins and losses. And so for me, it became very clear there was something about sports that resonated with people in a way that almost no other section of the newspaper does. And you can, and so I understood, I came to understand, you can write about anything. Sex, civic planning, drugs, money, anything. I mean, I've written about riots, violence. It doesn't matter. If it's involved with sports, people who might turn the page and go to a different section, if it's about a game, about something people desperately care about, they'll read that story in a way that they might not pay attention to it. And I also found that with sports, there's an honesty to it. Take the scandals and everything aside. When athletes are on the field, they're showing you who they are in a way that we find incredibly compelling. They can't hide. They tell you who they are under the ultimate pressure. There's tears, there's joy, and we relate to that. And then you turn around and you look in the stands, and everyone in the stands, when they're passionate about something, they're going to tell you who they are. And you look in the stands, and people are screaming in joy or fury, and you're learning about that community in a way that I would argue you don't get a chance to tap into any way else. And where I saw that most vividly was in the '89 earthquake. I was in the upper deck, and the stadium suddenly hopped, and it was 14 p.m. I think everybody who's here in Northern California remembers it. But the amazing thing to me was the stadium jumped, and I ran down to the field, and Ricky Henderson was looking up into the stands, and he's talking to somebody who had like a portable TV, and Ricky's mother was in Oakland, that's where he's from, and he was desperately asking, is the bridge down? Is the bridge down? And all the sort of line between professional sports and the fans had dissolved away in this sort of disaster. And obviously, San Francisco, Northern California, this emblematic disaster, the earthquake, which has informed everything about San Francisco in the last century. And it was merely it was merely a game, right? But it wasn't, it was more. And for me, everyone loves this new stadium down in San Francisco, but I love Candlestick. I love Candlestick. Now, I would argue during the day, Candlestick was a beautiful place to see a game. At night, it was a horror. The fog would come over, and the foghorn would blow, and the crazy crowd would dance, and it was horrible. But that stadium held in the earthquake, and I was in the upper deck, and it didn't collapse like I-880. And fall on people, and it didn't liquefy. It was built on bedrock. It didn't liquefy like the Marina District, where Joe DiMaggio, a sports hero, was in line with everybody else lined up in the aftermath of the disaster down the Marina. And so for me, Candlestick, I will love that place until the day I die, because it held, and there were thousands of people underneath the second deck that I was sitting in who are alive today because of it. So there's something about sports that has always struck me is, it tells us about the world in our society and culture in a way that no other, I would argue, no other sort of line of activity does in our culture. More than movies, more than theater, more than ballet, more than the arts, more than painting, everything else, there's something about it. So I am not a lacrosse guy. I didn't grow up with the game. But I came upon this game when I was covering the Duke lacrosse rape case in 2006 for Sports Illustrated, which became a media circus in the country, and these guys, three lacrosse players, white lacrosse players, were accused of raping a black stripper in Durham. She was later found and admitted that she was lying, but at the time, there was this incredible rush to judgment, and I went down to North Carolina and worked on that story. And there was certainly the cliche of the sort of prep school, upper class, white entitled lacrosse player, which is a caricature that exists to this day, certainly was borne out, but there were many exceptions to it. And that struck me, this deep connection to Wall Street, this, there were sons of firemen who had never been to college, they were the first in their family to go to college, and they were playing Division I lacrosse and used the sport to sort of elevate and get to the next strata, and just in the way that many sports are used to do that. And then in 2010, I went in and did a story on the Iroquois Nationals, who are the third best team in the world, and the Iroquois invented the game 1,000 years ago. And it's completely opposite, their approach to the game is completely opposite to the sort of upper class prep school idea of the sport. It's a spiritual practice for the Iroquois, and it's also a political instrument. The Iroquois, since for a century now, have traveled on their own passports. They insist that they are a sovereign people. They have a treaty signed by George Washington in 1794, the Treaty of Canandaigua, that to this day is honored by the United States government with $4,500 worth of muslin shipped to the each reserve of the 6 nations of the Confederacy, and divvied up throughout the Confederacy. And a few years ago, the U.S. government went to, not a few years, a couple decades ago, the U.S. government went to and said, hey, let's kind of end this $4,500 worth of muslin. Let's pay you off, and we'll just put this treaty to bed. And the Iroquois said, no. You are going to honor this treaty, because a treaty, by definition, is an agreement between two nations. And we are not a subject people. You've never conquered us. We are your allies, and we don't even recognize the Canadian border. And in 1983, Orrin Lyons, a great indigenous activist, and Wes Patterson, who created a stick maker, Tuscarora stick maker, who created the stick played with by this gentleman in the back row, way back in the day. Created the Iroquois Nationals as not just a sort of a reclamation of the Iroquois game, which they had been sort of disenfranchised by, but also as a vehicle for political sovereignty. And they have used the sport to travel around the world, and every time they get into another country, a foreign country, meaning their passport is recognized, they refuse to travel on anything but their own passports, that is a sort of reaffirmation, whether they go to England or Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, or Scotland, or any other country, including Israel in 2018. And they have the Iroquois twice, in 2010 and 2015, when their passports were not recognized, pulled out of the championships. Now, this is not a symbolic team. They are the third best team in the world. They're the only indigenous nation recognized by an international sporting body. And they play a dazzling, incredible wide open style, full of creativity, and part of it, of their charge, because the sport was created to entertain the creator 1,000 years ago. And so weirdly, they definitely want to win, they're very competitive, but they're the only big time team in any sport that I know of who still is animated by the philosophy of it. It doesn't matter if you win or lose, it's how you play the game. And so in 2018, I went to Israel, which is strange enough, if you can imagine. There were bombs flying even then, for the World Championships, World Field Lacrosse Championships. And the Iroquois we're stuck at Toronto Airport for 3 days. And we're again held up by their passport. Israel, one of the toughest countries to get into for obvious reasons, have very tough passport controls. And there was a great wrangling about whether Israel was going to allow them in, whether Canada was going to allow, guarantee their return. And as a result, there was a great wrangling. And there was a game scheduled, the opening game of the World Championships, set to be scheduled on ESPN against the great power and their great outrival, a great arch rival, the United States, who are the greatest power in lacrosse. And I'm sure you suspect and understand the United States also has a very fraught history with the Native Americans. So it's an incredibly loaded game for the Iroquois, also who go by their, now to this, in 2021 officially changed their name to the Haudenosaunee, which is their original name, and they've always called themselves that. Iroquois is a French term that was laid on them by French missionaries back in the 17th century. So finally, the game, no one knows. I'm there in Israel, and I've been to 10 Olympics. I've been to Super Bowls, World Series. I've been doing this for 40 years. I've never had a situation where literally the opening game of a World Championship that is about to be broadcast on a major network, no one knows if the other team's going to show up, and it's 24 hours before the game. The Iroquois are stuck at Toronto Airport, and they are, they can't practice, they can't play. They're stuck waiting for this to be resolved. So already they're at a disadvantage going into this game if they make it. And finally, after much wrangling, they get permission to fly in. They get on the last possible flight possible to get there in time for that game, and land in Israel 6 hours before the game is to begin.
Wow.
And so I want to read a passage from that, and I just want to let you know that as a sports writer, like I said, I was there for Kirk Gibson's home run. I was there in Beijing when Usain Bolt electrified the world. I covered Michael Jordan when he became Michael Jordan at the University of North Carolina his sophomore year. So I've seen a lot of electrifying things. I have never seen anything like what I saw the Iroquois do. And I just want to read to you that now. And as a sports writer, again, as somebody who thinks that sports and culture cross-hatch and weave and speak to each other and mirror each other, this was an astounding moment for me. So, later that night, well into the Iroquois game against the United States, there came a moment of pity. This is the emotion all outsiders, particularly white ones, risk whenever regarding Native Americans under pressure. It is a trap. Lo, the poor Indian, poet Alexander Pope wrote in all sincerity in 1733, but by the mid-1800s, lo, quote unquote, had evolved into snide shorthand for the very people whites were working furiously, systematically to destroy. When a New York sports writer in 1869 tired of scribbling the Mohawks or Indians in his admiring account of an early lacrosse exhibition, he resorted to the lows and knew his audience would get the joke. 5 years later, when the Bismarck Tribune set the tone for white settlers just before Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's expedition touched off the Black Hills gold rush, no one was laughing. This is a quote from the Bismarck Tribune. Humanitarians may weep for poor Lowe and tell the wrongs he has suffered, but he is passing away. Their prayers, their entreaties cannot change the law of nature, cannot arrest the causes which are carrying them on to their ultimate destiny, extinction. The American people need the country the Indians now occupy. An Indian war would do no harm, for it must come sooner or later. With 15 minutes and 13 seconds left in the second quarter, beneath a fading orange sky on a floodlit field in Netanya, Israel, the pity crept in. This was just after Lyle Thompson, one of the game's sublime talents and perhaps the greatest native player ever, went down. Setting up on the left wing, he had lowered his shoulder and begun angling toward the crease when U.S. long stick midfielder Michael Earhart stepped in with a stonewalling check, muscling Thompson to the turf, sending his stick whirling, stripping the national star of ball, weapon, and dignity. Woo! Quint Kesnick howled on the ESPN broadcast. That was epic! Indeed, it seemed an emblematic instant, the point when all the obstacles, the pre-tournament politics and uncertainty, the 2-day flight delay, the nick-of-time arrival, the lack of sleep, the disorienting jet lag, and the titanic presence of their opponent finally swamped the Iroquois like a crashing wave. Flying on adrenaline, the Nationals had started the game with 3 straight goals, and by the end of the first quarter held a stunning 5-3 lead. But now in the second, the Americans were coming hard and scored two easy goals to make it 5-5. Thompson was on his hands and knees, groping. Surely the inevitable fade had begun. Given perfect conditions, military organization, and seamless travel, the Iroquois would still have been vast underdogs. Not only was the U.S. the field game's overwhelming power, winning 9 of the 12 World Championships contested since 1967, it had crushed the Nationals in their 8 previous meetings by a combined score of 172-63. This U.S. squad was loaded with All-Americans, 3 Tewaaraton Award winners, that's the Heisman Trophy of lacrosse, the best face-off man in collegiate history, and in Paul Rabel, arguably the game's best ever professional and first ever $1 million player. Most important, it was a true team. Stung by its loss to Canada in the 2014 World Championship Final, in late 2015, U.S. Lacrosse hired Duke head coach John Danowski, who spent the next 30 months evaluating, selecting, and bonding his roster. In preparation for the game's mightiest, most efficient, and moneyed program, these Iroquois, meanwhile, had practiced together once. One day to go over clears, go over our ride, go over an offense, and we never officially put it in. Lyle Thompson set up their ad hoc workout in Toronto 2 days before. Our guys don't know it like the back of their hand. We're kind of learning it. This is our first game, and we're still learning our offense. And yet, after Earhart's withering check, the Nationals didn't buckle. Lyle Thompson sprung to his feet, grabbed up his stick. He looked strikingly buoyant, and even more so 2.5 minutes later when, fed the ball in Iroquois territory, he unleashed a full stride sprint up the field's right side. Thompson crossed midfield, churned deep into the U.S. defense, cradling furiously, then slowed and scanned for a teammate with a better angle. He might as well have been alone. American midfielder Tom Schreiber, whose play as a pro in 2018 had many anointing him the game's best, ran Thompson down and squared off, the only one standing now between Thompson and U.S. goalie John Galloway. With just one step to his left, Schreiber could have closed off Thompson's slight sight line to the goal, a channel maybe 5 inches wide. Thompson's stickhead waggled once, twice. What looked lazy was actually a cobra flaring its hood. Schreiber didn't step. 5 inches was enough. Thompson leaned right, planted, and snapped, whipped the ball from his waist 15 yards into a hole low between the just late Galloway and the left post, about the size of a teacup. It was Thompson's 3rd goal of the game, a hat trick midway through the second quarter. Nobody on the field had played close to his level. Schreiber stared at the goal furious. Then he gave the slightest shrug as if to say, too good. On ESPN's live broadcast, Carcaterra was asked if being helicoptered had woken Thompson up. Doesn't need to, he yelled. This guy looks at the game differently. He's got a short memory, an incredible athletic burst, and the skill of an absolute legend. About then, any sense of pity dissolved, replaced, as the clock to halftime ticked down, by a sense that something remarkable was at hand and a question. Would the world notice? Netanya Stadium, built for soccer with a capacity of 13,600, was only about 1/3 filled. Lacrosse had been played in Israel only since 2011, and the country was still learning. That day's tournament preview in the Jerusalem Post found it necessary to include a short tutorial. Modern field lacrosse is a contact sport in which two teams compete for possession of a rubber ball using metal sticks with mesh nets. I just want you to imagine if the World Series was being held in San Francisco. Little chronicles like, we now will explain baseball. Points are scored by shooting the ball into the opposing team's net. Different positions have different sticks. Meanwhile, though the game was being beamed live in the U.S. on ESPN2, its time slot, midsummer, midday on the American East Coast, promised relatively few viewers. Casual sports fans barely knew of the event's existence. From a programming promotional standpoint, have you heard a peep about this while watching ESPN over the past 2 weeks? Play-by-play man Anish Shroff said the day before. Had this been a bigger event, a bigger sport, you wouldn't have gotten just a little mention. You would have gotten just a little mention, a little promo on SportsCenter. To hear the ESPN broadcast team, the most publicity anyone could expect from this tournament game or any other was a highlight clip on the top 10 plays of the week. Yet now the Iroquois Nationals, who had never before led against an American men's field team, had absorbed the first U.S. counterpunch and taken its second lead of the night, 6-5, after crossing 6 time zones and arriving just 6 hours earlier. The strain didn't end there. By the time the players reached their hotel rooms, it was 3 p.m., too late for a decent sleep. Then came a quick meal, another bus trip for the 20-minute ride to the stadium. Then at 6:45 p.m., the Iroquois, after declining the option of sitting out the opening ceremonies, congregated on field for 30 minutes with 45 other nations in a draining 85-degree heat. Once the game began, the Iroquois players weren't the only ones feeling each other out. The coaches were still learning how to mesh. Though in charge of the defense, early on Lars Tiffany found himself also running the substitution box. The last-minute withdrawals had riddled the Nationals' eternally suspect defense. Tiffany plugged holes with a converted midfielder, an untested teenager, and a very rusty Johnson Jimerson. But between Lyle Thompson and his brother Miles, co-Tuaraton winners in 2014, the oft-unstoppable Tahoka Nanticoke, Randy Stats, and his rapidly emerging younger brother Austin, the Iroquois also had arguably the game's most explosive offense. And with the U.S. attack disorganized, goalie Warren Hill in good rhythm, and Lyle humming, any fear about being overwhelmed died. With 3:43 left in the half, Randy Stats posted up just outside the crease and flicked in an overhand goal, extending the Nationals' lead to 7-5. But now the scoreboard, just numbers, couldn't transmit the palpable energy rising now off the Iroquois or explain that this first half represented the Hautenosaunee's most emphatic step in 3 decades toward reclaiming their game. Earhart had 5 inches and 35 pounds on Lyle Thompson and leveled it. Yet with 49 seconds left in the half, on the left wing and accelerating, Thompson poked a nifty jab step at U.S. midfielder Will House. This time untouched, it was the American going down to his hands and knees. With 9 seconds left in the half, the American defense broke down again, and Lyle Thompson lasered a final shot wide. U.S. midfielder Jake Bernhardt decked a goal-rushing Nanticoke from behind as time expired, his momentum plunging him straight into Miles Thompson, who shoved Bernhardt, and suddenly Lyle and the Stats brothers rushed in, and a trio of U.S. defenders converged. Jawing and pushing ensued. For Mexico attackman Timothy Gonzalez, sitting in the stands, it was a perfect snapshot of Iroquois defiance. They went in there like they had something to prove, that they belonged there, he said. What they're doing in their culture by not wanting to get colonized is one of the greatest things that can happen now. To never forget where you come from, to represent who you are. And the fact that they came in, no complaints, landed, came right to the game, played, and the way that they played to show everybody, this is our sport. You guys took it from us, so we're going to give you the hardest time. It's going to take all your blood, sweat, and tears to beat us. Everyone knew the Nationals had to be exhausted. Everyone knew this made no sense. But even the most hard-eyed lacrosse mind was thinking, wait, the Iroquois can actually win this. Listen, our talent pool is like this big, Nationals assistant coach Scott Marr said, cupping his hands tightly together. Then he spread his arm as wide as possible to describe Team USA. Their pool is this big. The fact that we ran with them and were ahead of them for the first time after a 13-hour jet, Marr, white American, product of Johns Hopkins, shouldn't have been surprised. He coached Lyle, Miles, and their cousin Ty Thompson in Albany from 2011 to 2015. But with the trip to Israel, he became immersed in their program, not vice versa. The opening against the U.S. was Marr's full-body baptism, pro and con, in lacrosse the Iroquois way. Red Burnham kept warning me. The fight in them, that resiliency is amazing, he said. As a people, to live how they lived for these last couple hundred years and to be pushed onto reservations, the white man has tried to stop them out, and they just can't. So, one last thing, and I'll open it up. There is an ongoing question now with the Haudenosaunee Nationals. Lacrosse has been admitted as a sport to the 2028 Olympics, but the IOC so far is insisting that the Haudenosaunee will not be allowed to play, which is a public relations disaster that they have no understanding of. If the Iroquois are allowed to play, they would like to play under their own flag in Los Angeles. I don't think that's going to happen. The IOC is pretty hard-headed about that. They don't recognize the Iroquois as a nation, the Haudenosaunee. But if they rule against and continue to say that the Haudenosaunee can't play, it is going to be an incredible disaster on U.S. soil. First Olympics played first lacrosse Olympics played in 80 years. And the flip side is that if the IOC allows them to play, it would be an incredible public relations boom. They would look great. There are precedents for this. There's a refugee Olympic team that was allowed to play in 2016. Whatever the IOC wants to do, they can do if they want to. So there's a new president of the IOC, Christy Coventry, and if she decides she wants the Haudenosaunee to play, they'll be able to play. It's that simple. It's not, they can wave around all kinds of different rules and say, oh, our regulations don't allow it. There are plenty of exceptions. They can do whatever they want. So, and they'll realize a great public relations boom. If they don't, it would be not just damaging for the IOC, but it would really be bad for the game of lacrosse, because after all, the caricature of the game is pretty set in stone in the public at large, if not in the game itself. People think it's a very entitled and white game, and if that game is the only game that shows up without the Iroquois, it's going to be a disaster for the game as well. And at the same time, if they're allowed, it's going to be a great advantage and great boon for the sport as well. So it's something to keep your eyes out for going forward as the Olympics get closer and closer. So anyway, with that long-winded introduction of, my God, 35 minutes, sorry about that. Any questions?
Do you have Christy's email?
I'm sorry?
Do you have Christy's email?
I do not have her email, and by the way, they have, I did an excerpt from the book, ran in the New York Times Sunday Magazine in May, and so I've actually had to go and get back to the IOC. They, since 2023, have issued statements saying, you know, the Iroquois are not recognized as a National Olympic Committee by our organization. They are free to play for the US or Canada, which of course makes the Haudenosaunee heads explode. And they have continually done nothing more to explain their position than just repeat that statement over and over. So for the moment, they've been very hard-headed about it, but in July, the new president came in, so it could all change. We'll see.
So I presume Canada is the third of the kind of big players?
Canada's the, US is the best in field lacrosse. Canada is the best in box lacrosse, which is the indoor version of the game, which was created in the 30s when the owners of the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto
Maple Leafs?
Maple Leafs, thank you. Toronto Maple Leafs needed I'm just a sports writer. needed to fill their buildings in the off season, and immediately that game superseded not just it completely sort of decimated the field game in Canada and became the number one game for Canadians. But also because Canadians had effectively banned the Iroquois from their own game in 1880, and because under the guise of professionalism, box lacrosse happily paid players, so as a result, box became the game that the Iroquois then took up and played. So in World Championships terms, the classic game that is played in the field that you think of when you think of lacrosse is dominated by the U.S. The indoor game is dominated by Canada. They've won every World Championships, and for the longest time, the second best indoor team was the Iroquois, and the U.S. was third. But just at the most recent championships, the U.S. beat the Iroquois for the first time ever in box. So they're making inroads in that game. Now, to make things even more confusing and perhaps dull, because they wanted to appeal to the Olympics, lacrosse created sixes, which is a cut-down version of the game on a shorter field, smaller rosters, faster time clock, everything, to basically appeal to television audiences. Because if they had the original field game, there's no way that would have become an Olympic sport. So it was a smart move to sell the game, but there's a lot of inside the game, traditionalists who don't like this new version, but are like, yeah, but we're in the Olympics, so it's awesome.
Yeah. What other countries are starting to
Good.
get some excitement?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about lacrosse, and we were speaking about it earlier, is that you can ramp up a good program pretty early, and a lot of countries, most of them, by importing Italians, Irish, Jewish kids to Israel to play and play under their flag. So the kids who played at colleges who can't make the U.S. team have sort of, so Ireland's become, Israel has become a top, Japan has become a top power. It's growing, but for the moment, the U.S. and Canada have not been beat. So they're continue to be the champions in everything. And secretly, the powers that be would love for Japan or some other country, or probably not Israel right now, but Italy, Ireland, to bring it up and beat one of them, because it would really show that the game is growing.
So you're saying that a lot of the Irish and Italian players are coming from the U.S.?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, they have a grandparent.
Yeah.
And lacrosse kind of, there's now like 94, 95 countries in world lacrosse.
Oh.
Like, it's played on all continents and everything else. But the rules for eligibility were really relaxed for a lot of them, and they once you're in one or two times, then in the World Championships, then the eligibility rules get tougher. So they want to like Mexico. Greece had an incredible team in 2018. So and that was the first time they were there. So it's and it was seeded with a lot of Greek play. In fact, the guy who created the Greek team was from Tufts, and he basically went down through rosters looking for Greek names to contact on NCAA rosters, and basically, and it was smart. It was smart. So look, World Lacrosse likes to say, "Oh, we're an international game," but most of those players lived in the U.S. or live in the U.S. and certainly played in the U.S. And then the hope is that they go and Mexico became, after like four championships, became an almost completely homegrown team. So it has worked, but it's taking its time.
So, is Jimmy Brown acknowledged to be the best American lacrosse player?
That's a great question. So Jim Brown is the great, some people would regard him as the greatest
Oh,
football player.
absolutely, the
Running back
greatest
of all
running
time.
back I
Yeah.
ever saw.
And Cleveland Browns, incredible. His favorite sport, though, was lacrosse. He loved it because he basically said, when we go play lacrosse in practice, we actually play lacrosse as opposed to in football where you go and grind it out. And his favorite coach at Syracuse, in fact, he had great run-ins with the essentially racist head coach at Syracuse, but Royce Simmons, his coach, lacrosse coach, is someone who defended him. He was an assistant football coach and the head lacrosse coach. Jim Brown, in some ways, in tribute, to pay back Royce Simmons, went to play lacrosse for him. And at the time, I mean, he only had 3 seasons of lacrosse and then never played again. I mean, he played in high school in Manhasset, but He was an incredible player. He was unstoppable. Everyone at the time was probably 5'8", 170 pounds, and Jim Brown was 6'2", 220, and running, at 4'3", 40. I mean, he just ran everybody over. But there are some myths about Brown in terms of that they kind of wanted to dismiss him as, well, he just sort of held the stick against his chest and did cradle and ran, and there was a rule created called the Jim Brown rule. It's not true, actually. That rule didn't go into effect for another 17 years, so it was BS. And actually, people saw him play. He was an incredible stick handler. He could score with either hand, one-handed, and so he was in his final season. He played with Royce Simmons' son, who then became the great coach of Syracuse, and his other co-captain was Orrin Lyons, who was All-American goalie and the creator of the Iroquois Nationals. Again, a gift to a sports writer when a character does double, triple, quadruple duty. Orrin Lyons, is sort of like the Zelig of the game. He's been everywhere. And Jim Brown and he were very, very close. And I never got the chance, and so yes, let me answer your question. At the time, there was a North-South All-Star game in Baltimore, and this was Jim Brown's last game, and he completely dominated in the first half, and all the Hopkins coaches were there, and essentially Hopkins at that time was the authority in the game, and the New York Yankees of lacrosse. They've won over 44 national championships. And the great coach Bob Scott, as well as everybody else there, said, this is the greatest player we've ever seen. So at the time, they said Jim Brown was the greatest of all time. I will tell you that there are a lot of players since that, some of them are Powell, Mikey Powell, Casey Powell, Gary Gate at Syracuse. There are a lot of people who would argue that they were just as good or better. Lyle Thompson is in that conversation. The sport knows it has an image problem. And it's considered a white sport, and I personally think that there's a little bit of, hey, look, you can't call us a racist sport. There's a lot of racism in lacrosse. There's been a lot of the N-word dropped, even in the last 5 years while I was working on this book. Kyle Harrison, the great player from Hopkins, who's the greatest black player since Jim Brown, said it's still happening and it's got to stop in time for the Olympics because we're reintroducing ourselves to the game. So there's a lot of that. And I think as a little bit of a hedge, lacrosse people like to say, see, our greatest player is Jim Brown. Jim Brown, weirdly, unlike, say, Venus and Serena Williams, there wasn't a flood after Jim Brown of great black players who went into the game. Like, it just sort of, he was such an anomaly. And there was real elements of racism in the game throughout the 20th and 21st century. Interestingly enough, though, Jim Brown and Kyle Harrison both said to me, and there were many black players who told me that they experienced it, current players, but both Jim Brown and Kyle Harrison said they never experienced racism at all. And Kyle Harrison will tell you, well, that might be just because they didn't want to piss us off, because we were the best on the field. You're going to make us matter, so it's a great question, and he's certainly regarded as one of the top players of all time, no question. He was unstoppable. Although, let me just tell you one other question. Again, 500 pages. So I can go on, we got about 15 minutes. So the legend is that Jim Brown never left his feet once on a lacrosse field. But one time he went up to the Onondaga box, and which was an outdoor box, so they played box lacrosse on the reservation, and that became the game that sort of replaced field. But they had an outdoor box, an indoor arena, but they played and trained there. And Jim Brown went up there not knowing the rules of box lacrosse, and a little mosquito, as Jim Brown called him, named Irving Powless, who was a chief, and ended up being a chief, hip checked Jim Brown and knocked him off his feet. And it's still, to this day, remains a legendary moment up in Onondaga. And Irving Powless, basically, was a hero for the rest of his life. People are like, yeah, you're a chief, big deal, but you're the guy who knocked Jim Brown off his feet. Austin.
Sorry. No, it's not. No, please, go ahead. Quickly.
I don't know if I can do quickly.
Where is Coventry from? B,
She's a South African swimmer.
I was afraid you were going to say that. And where is, did your Sunday Times magazine piece move the needle? Do you hope this book moves the needle on the IOC's decision? And the last part of the question is, what happened in the second half of that match?
So, no, it's a great question, because what happens, was halftime. So what happened at halftime of that is that they had not eaten, and basically, when they got into the locker room, there was this locker room attendant from Israel, like some kid, like 17, and the GM is like throwing money at him, says, look, go to any store nearby and get some chips and water or something, because nobody had eaten. So they sat down, and all the adrenaline of the trip drained away, and they came out and sagged, and in the second half, they got beat once again. But it remains, and I'm not kidding, that first half remains one of the most electrifying things I've ever seen. And when I think about it and talk about it, the hair on the back of my neck still goes up, because it made zero sense. And it was really an incredible testament to what these people are about, long and short, culturally, historically, everything. Sorry, what was the first question?
Just like,
Oh, so the New York Times thing. I have no idea what the power of any book is, or the New York Times is at this point in time. It can't hurt that the case was made for them. The amazing thing, okay, so in 2022, the World Games, which I hate to confuse this, it's just impossible. There's something called the World Games, which actually just happened like a week ago again, like 4 years ago, in Birmingham, Alabama, which is, the World Games are a IOC adjacent games that is basically the tryout for sports that want to get into the Olympics. So there are all these weird, bizarre sports. Corfing is one of them. It's insane. But lacrosse was one of them, and the IOC goes and observes it, so they know what's going on. And what happened was, the World Games invited lacrosse and left the number 3 ranked team out, the Iroquois Nationals, because they followed IOC rules. And it created an incredible blow up. There was social media blow up, and everybody in the game, to their credit, the United States, Canada, Paul Rabel, Joe Tsai, who was the big money man in the game, Brooklyn Nets owner, all came to the Iroquois defense. And what happened then, and for those of you who are Irish in the house, I think you'll appreciate this, the World Games backed down, said the Iroquois can play, but a qualification had already happened, the field had already been set, so a team was gonna have to volunteer and give up their place at the World Games. And the Irish team put up its hand and said, we don't belong here. They're 12th ranked, the Iroquois were 3rd ranked, so we don't belong here, they do, we're giving back what they deserve. And it was one of the great acts of sportsmanship that I've ever seen. They actually ended up, they're the first foreign team to ever, or foreign body or participant to win a Stan Musial Sportsmanship Award, and they're heroes for doing that. It was a gracious, beautiful moment. So there's an incredible, like, people, you can't beat the Iroquois in public relations. Like, literally, you cannot beat the Native Americans. Like, there is such a well of sympathy for them, and guilt from all of us, that you're just like, are you fucking kidding me? They invented the sport, the number 3 team in the world, and we're having an event on US soil that we took from them, and you're not gonna allow them to play the game they invented, and you're gonna play the game without them? It's a disaster. And as you know, Austin, the IOC is fully capable of being dopey, blind, and ridiculous, and getting in their own way of what is actually a great story. The Iroquois, their biggest fear, the reason they don't want this, is that they think, well, if we open that Pandora's box, and the Aborigines in Australia and the Catalonians in Spain are going to demand representation. The difference is that these are the people who invented the game. These are the people who are one of the greatest players of the game, and it's on American soil. It's a complete anomaly, and they can say, one time only, just do this now, if they're smart. But is the IOC smart? Good question. We'll see. Sir.
Yeah, so actually I want to bounce off what you just said, because my question is, do you think that it has more to do with that precedent of we're allowing all of these marginalized and oppressed and occupied groups into sports, or is it setting the precedent of, okay, they can do this on American soil because there's no passport hassle, the next Olympics they're going to want to do it again, and then there is this hassle, and here's this bad publicity for the IOC. And then beyond that, my question is also, do you think that the current administration is going to have any impact on this decision from the IOC about
So-
these Olympics in general?
Incredibly great questions from someone I've
That's
never
also
met
my
before.
question.
Yeah, from two people whom I've never met before. You should know that the Biden administration in 2023, Joe Biden came out at a Native American conference at the White House in favor of the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, competing under their own flag, not just competing, but under their own flag in Los Angeles. And then 3 days before leaving office, Biden again came out in concert with Justin Trudeau, and they together said, we advocate and urge the IOC to allow the Haudenosaunee to compete under their own flag. I don't know about you, but the Haudenosaunee right now are like keeping their heads low. They're not putting up their hands, they don't want to say anything, because they basically don't want the Trump beam to come their way. Because if it's anything Joe Biden did, their feeling is, well, he's going to do the opposite on the principle of George Costanza doing the opposite. So sorry, Charlie. So it's, and just so you know, it's not so much the passport problem, because many countries have actually let them in at this point. And they can also just say, you can compete under the Olympic banner. So the question is whether the Haudenosaunee will accept competing under the Olympic banner. They twice, and actually 3 times, have demonstrated that they will, if they're not allowed to compete with their own passports under their own banner, they won't show. Will they turn down a chance, even under the banner, to have 1 billion people see them in their uniform? I mean, the overriding phrase that I hear from Native Americans while doing this book, both the Haudenosaunee and elsewhere, is, we are still here. We are still here. And there's no better way to send that message to 1 billion people who don't pay attention to lacrosse than to do that in the Olympics. And the next Olympics are going to be held in Adelaide and in Australia. And Australia is one of the 4 original lacrosse playing nations. So it's quite possible that if it goes well for lacrosse in Los Angeles, that Australia would, because basically it's one of the sports that the host can name and have, that the hosts in Australia might have lacrosse as well, and they would certainly want the Haudenosaunee there. So it's really a question. Fisk.
I have a couple. One is not a question, but more of a, just for informational purposes, surfing in the Olympics. The Tahitians wanted to surf under their own flag because
Right.
the event was in Tahiti.
Right.
And it was ongoing, and the Olympic Committee caved.
Yeah.
And,
No, that's a really good point.
yeah,
Yeah.
and there was a bunch of environmental
They
issues.
can cave, it's all BS. Yeah, else you can do it, the refugee Olympic team is made up of, like, people who have no country. And we're trying, and they allowed them to come and compete. And by the way, it was an incredible boon for a sport that was had one public relations disaster after another to have the refugee Olympic team. And so if they're smart, they'll do it.
But my question is this, so you have a sport like lacrosse that has all the elements of great American sports. It's got a violent element, it's
Yeah.
competitive, there's skill aspect to
Yeah.
it, there's speed. And I know that there's the Ivy League component, but if you look at American football, there was also a big Ivy League component
Yeah.
when that was
Yeah.
came off the ground. So the question I have is, why did lacrosse not become a professional sport like baseball or football or basketball?
Well, first of all, it was taken up by a Canadian dentist, a future Canadian dentist named George Beers, 17 years old. And he basically then codified the rules and wanted to make it Canada's game. And he was copying Victorian ideas of sport, amateurism, not professional sports. And then when it moved down to, and then Queen Victoria saw a game, and she was like, oh, pretty, how nice. And then it moved down to the United States in the late 1800s, and it was immediately taken up by Ivy Leagues and Hopkins and elite universities, and that's where it stuck. So I can't tell you why it didn't become a professional game, but the weirdest thing about lacrosse is that the reward in lacrosse is not playing pro sport. A professional lacrosse is making $70,000, $80,000 a year, maybe, if they're playing all the time, indoor and outdoor. the big reward payoff for playing college lacrosse is getting a job on Wall Street, and there's all these networks. That is the other remarkable thing. More lacrosse players than any other sport died at the Twin Towers in 9/11, because that's where lacrosse lived, that's where all these guys went. And the amazing thing was, like, Yale has Barclays sewn up, a complete pipeline of Barclays from Yale to Barclays. Dartmouth has Goldman Sachs sewed up. I mean, it's unlike any other sport, and that's why this was so interesting to me, because it revealed things that no other sport does, including the Native American element. So, I just want to say one thing. So, we're almost done, and again, this sort of. I got to talk about it. But also, I just want to say this. So 40 years ago, I was, working all over Northern California. I was driving from Davis and into Sacramento. I was driving a 1960 Plymouth Fury, push-button transmission. There was no air conditioning, so the windows were down. You could smell the dirt of the Central Valley, the turned earth, coming through your windows. Incredible odor that resonated with me to this day. I mean it was beautiful. And I would come down to, every Sunday I would ride the back door, down I-80, 37, over to Mill Valley, and I would sit at the depot. I would buy a Sunday New York Times, and sit in the sunshine. And the depot then, the bookstore has really come down. In the 80s, it was a remarkable bookstore in Mill Valley, right in the center of town. Incredible selection, really Northern California based, but also just eclectic selection. And I would go in there and I'd look at the books and think, wow, it'd be nice to be there someday. And I would sit there in the plaza and read the paper, and I was dreaming of something. And I've written 4 other books besides this, and I worked for Sports Illustrated for 26 years. But one reason it was important for me to come here and see all your faces is so many people. There are people here from Davis from 40 years ago, from different stages of my life. I was dreaming of something. This is what I was dreaming of. And now you must buy a book. Or not, you can sneak out.